Good evening. I only played one game again this week, this time at the Worcester Club, and I was up against Mike Odell, who's rated 2060. He's a very strong player, but he's a player against whom I have a very good record, so I felt pretty good going into this game. He opened with d4, he had the white pieces. I played knight f6, and he played knight f3. Mike eventually plays c4, but what playing knight f3 does first for white is I guess it's a little bit less ambitious, but it avoids some openings that white might prefer not to have to study. For example, the Budapest Gambit with 2e5 for black, an opening which I have played a lot over the years. Knight f3 for white, I played g6, and then after c4, bishop g7, knight c3, I played d5, going into, yet again, an opening I've struggled a lot with this year, an opening called the Grunfeld. Mike took on d5, and after knight takes d5, played e4. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, and as I've said many times in the past, white gets a nice big center, but black immediately gets counterplay against that center and a chance to break it down with the move c5, and hopes to show that that center is not a strength but a weakness. It's the typical hyper-modern way of doing things. Mike played rook b1 here, and you might recall from an earlier video that I played against a gentleman named Larry Gladding who put his light-squared bishop on c4. Maybe before knight f3, I don't recall. But what I concluded in that game is that my queen a5 move, which I played shortly after that, was not good, at least because the light-squared bishop from c4 was defending the pawn on a2. And as it turns out, again in this game, I managed to play queen a5 when it wasn't a good idea. Mike played rook b1. I castled. It's hard for castle to be a bad move, so I am very inclined to castle kingside when I get the chance. Mike played bishop to e2, and here I threw in my, yet again, not very good queen a5. Though it looked pretty attractive to me during the game. It hits this pawn on a2, hits the pawn on c3, which will be taken with check, and it threatens to take on d4 at a time when white can't recapture with the pawn on c3, which would mean that black kind of succeeds in his quest to make a hole in white's center, to break it down in some significant way. And I saw that white would likely respond with queen d2. What the computer points out is that white can actually castle here, and it just turns out that white has tremendous compensation for black going ahead and grabbing a pawn here. But what Mike did instead is queen d2, and that's what I expected, and I thought, while thinking about this position, that I could claim some kind of an advantage in this position compared to a normal Grunfeld position, because I'm used to seeing white's dark squared bishop on the e3 square, and here white's queen blocks that. The problem, though, is that with the rook on b1, now that white's weaknesses are protected, a2 and c3 are both defended by the queen on d2, and c takes d4 can now be met by c takes d4. So all three of black's threats were dealt with by one white move. White is threatening to play rook b5, forking the queen on a5 and the pawn on c5. And though white's rook might end up kind of awkward on the c5 square, black's c5 pawn is important to him, because it's the main way he can break down the white center. So already here I was in a position which struck me as not very good. And I didn't really see any option except to take on d4, and after c takes d4, to get rid of the problem of my queen being vulnerable to rook b5 by playing queen takes d2 check. However, after bishop to d2, it's pretty obvious that white is better. White has 4 developed pieces to black's 1, and significantly more space thanks to his e4 and d4 pawns. I played knight c6, hoping to complete my development with possibly b6, at which point my light-squared bishop can move without dropping a pawn, connecting my rooks, and then maybe I'd bring my rooks to the d and c files and hope to equalize. But Mike played some good aggressive moves here. He played d5, And I kind of dismissed this move during the game because I thought I would just play knight d4 or knight e5, and that would likely result in a trade of minor pieces, and that would be what I want because I have a space deficit right now. So I played knight d4, and since this is a fork of the bishop on e2 and the knight on f3, something is going to get traded off. But as it turns out, after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, white's advantage is still significant. And white, again, Mike found a very nice move here. If I were in his position, I'd be tempted to castle. Yes, the queens are off the board, but there are enough pieces here, including 2 bishops for each side, that I'm not sure I want my king in the center. But Mike found a much better move in bishop to b4. He's hitting the pawn on e7, and it turns out that that pawn is not defensible. If I play rook to e8, bishop b5 hits the rook on e8, and I lose the e7 pawn anyway, or I drop an exchange. So the only thing I could come up with here, from this yet again losing position in the Grunfeld, is bishop to d7. With the idea that if white takes on e7, which is what Mike did, then at some point I'm going to have bishop to c3 check, which might make things awkward for white because he has to move his king. And maybe I can develop some kind of an attack. I played rook fe8 first, which allows white to play d6, but I have to get my rook out of the way. And so yeah, here white is probably technically winning because this pawn on d6 is extremely strong. But I played bishop c3 looking for counterplay. And here it's very dangerous for white to go to d1 because after bishop a4 check, king c1, and then some rook move to the c-file, black is going to get a revealed check when he moves the dark squared bishop. And it's hard to imagine that there won't be some way for him to win material, even if it's just playing bishop f6 check followed by regaining the pawn with bishop takes e7. So after bishop c3 check, Mike, I think correctly, played king f1. And now bishop c6 protects the pawn on b7 and puts pressure on the pawn on e4. Mike's f3 I didn't like during the game because it makes this bishop look kind of sad, and because there might be some line in which that bishop is exposed to an attack from the rook on e8. But it turns out to be computer approved, so what do I know? It does at least allow the white king to get out of the way of the rooks so that the other rook can be developed and white can just make the claim that he is at least equal in activity, and so his extra pawn plus all his extra space plus the fact that his extra pawn is protected and passed should mean he's winning. King g7 here. If I'm going to come back into this game, the only hope is to play bishop f6, forcing the trade of dark squared bishops, at which point I hope that an attack on the d-pawn combined with control of the e5 square will lead to me regaining the pawn before white can play e5 to defend it. Mike played king to f2, and I decided to throw in bishop d4 check before playing bishop f6, because I thought his king was worse on g3 than f2. It's no longer defending the bishop on e2, and maybe it doesn't have as good of access to the center as it did before, although I'm not too sure about that. Bishop to f6. Okay, white has to take on f6, king takes f6. And now if white doesn't do anything, of course, black is going to round up this pawn, hopefully, somehow. But, you know, I'm not even sure of that. But right now, at least, black has control of the e5 square and hopes to go after this pawn. Mike played king f4, which is a nice move. Whoops, no he didn't. What did he do? Oh yeah, rook hd1. He's putting more support behind this pawn on d6. Would love to advance it with a win at some point, of course. I played rook ad8, activating my last piece. And now Mike threw in bishop b5, and this is a nice move. What Mike's doing here is trading off the defender of the b7 pawn and a defender of the d7 square. He's allowing a trade into a rook ending, and there's that saying about how all rook endings are drawn. Of course, that saying is tongue-in-cheek, but it has some value. But I think this was a good move here. After my bishop takes b5, rook takes b5, b6, Mike found the move king to f4. And his idea now is that I'm no longer controlling e5, no longer hitting that square enough times to stop him from playing e5 check. And once he plays e5, the passed pawn on d6 will be protected, at which point white should just be winning the game. I played h6, hoping to get the chance to play g5 check, regaining control of e5, but Mike correctly threw in e5 check here before I got the chance, and after king e6, king e4. White hopes to play f4, g3 if necessary, just creating a massive chain of pawns in the center, all supporting the very nice pawn on d6. I guess if black has anything going for him, it's that this rook on b5 is out of play. So if black's down in material and down in space, the only area in which he can hope to get some kind of compensating advantage is in piece activity. So if the black rooks can be made to be stronger, significantly stronger than the white rooks, maybe black can save the game. I played f5 check. I was considering f6 and f5 here. f6 tries to break down the white pawn center, but would be responded to with f4, when even though I can trade on e5, there will be a recapture there with a pawn, and the passed pawn on d6 is still protected. f5 check is interesting, but if it doesn't give black the activity he's looking for, it's just bad. And that's because at some point white's going to play f4, and it's no longer possible for black to even reduce this pawn chain to 2 pawns. Now there's permanently going to be a third pawn on f4, protecting the pawn on e5, protecting the pawn on d6. I could play g5 at some point, but white will play g3, and even if I get in h4, white's going to maintain this f4, e5, d6 pawn structure. Okay, but I can't really wait around. Mike's a very strong player, and if I do that, he's going to find a way to win. So I played f5 check, hoping for king d4, which is what he played, when I can play rook c8. Rook c8 was not possible before because of d7, but here white's king is in the way of the rook on d1, so there's time for black to play rook to c8, looking for counterplay with the rooks. Rook d2 from Mike, that's fine, protecting his second rank. He doesn't really want a black rook showing up there and gobbling up all the pawns. And now rook c6. Again, black's only hope here is to achieve a big activity advantage by putting both rooks on the c-file and invading and delivering some checks in a way that gives counterplay. And Mike here made a mistake. Now is probably the time to play f4. And after black doubles on the c-file, white can cover the third rank with rook b3, and you'll see why that's important in the game continuation. What Mike actually played is rook b to b2, threatening to challenge me for control of the c-file, but of course he should expect the best move in response, which is me stopping him from putting a rook on the c-file by playing rook e to c8. And now he played f4, but the difference here is that after rook to c4 check, and Mike's king e3, though it's true that if rook c to 3 check, white can interpose with rook d3, and it's true that the pawn on f4 is protected by the white king, black has the move rook to e4 check, and white cannot defend the pawn on f4. If he plays his king back to f2, first of all, actually, let's look at king f3. King f3 allows rook c3 check. And now he can't defend his pawn anymore, and there's no more rook d3 interposition because the white king is not defending that square anymore. And after rook f2, rook takes f4 check, for example, rook e2, rook e4 check, sorry, king e1, rook e4 check, rook e2. Black's already snapping up the central pawns for white with rook takes e5. And for example, rook takes e5, king takes e5, rook d2 doesn't force the queening of the white pawn because after rook c8, d7, rook d8, black's going to grab that pawn as well. And king to f2 immediately also gives up the f4 pawn. So after king to e3, rook e4 check, Mike had no choice but to go back to the d3 square, which transposes to what the position would have been if he had played king d3 immediately, because I took the pawn on f4. All right, so this is a big gain for black. Black got significantly more activity with the rooks, and that was transformed into the winning back of the pawn he lost. And though at this point in the game I was still thinking I had a disadvantage because of these strong-looking pawns on e5 and d6, the truth is that this position is equal, and that if anyone's playing for a win at this point, it's black. Material is now equal, but black still has more active rooks. And an interesting thing is that if we get into a king and pawn ending, the black king is able to stop both of the white pawns, but the white king is going to have a hard time stopping both potential black passed pawns. So this is starting to look better and better for black. I guess the downside is that this rook on f4 is now kind of out of play. Mike played rook b to c2, good move, challenging me for control of the c file, saying, okay, I gave the pawn back, but I'm going to get some activity in exchange and we're going to be equal. I played rook takes c2. If rook takes c2, which was not played in the game, I think there's just king takes e5 here, threatening rook to d4 check, picking up this pawn on d6. So Mike instead played king takes c2, and now is threatening d7, of course. And king d7 is probably not an acceptable way to defend, because after e6 check, I either have to allow these two 6th rank pawns to continue to exist, or I have to play king takes e6 when d7 creates a new queen for white. So the right way to respond here is rook c4 check, Mike played king b3, and then rook c8, so that if white plays d7, that pawn turns out to be a weakness, and rook to d8, followed by rook takes d7, wins it. Okay, Mike played rook to e2, which was necessary. It's interesting how the initiative kind of went back and forth in this game. Black had the initiative with his activity, and then white had this initiative because of the threat to play d7, so black had to come back and defend. But now that defense has been executed on, white has to defend this pawn on e5. Black's threatening to just grab it, so Mike played rook e2. I played rook c5, and I'm not really threatening to take on e5 here, because white would just trade rooks and then queen the d-pawn. But the rook on c5 is a little bit more active than the rook on c8. It controls b5, which is a square the white king might like to use, and there might be a check on b5 that's of some importance in the future. Mike played rook d2. That forces me back to c8, because the problem again is that he's threatening d7, which would win. So rook to c8, and Mike played rook e2 and offered a draw. I had offered a draw a few moves earlier, but by this point I realized that it was black who was playing for a win here. So I declined it and played on with g5. Yes, white's pawns still look very intimidating, but they're both blockaded by the black king, and there's not much that white can do about that. In order to play d7, he has to have his rook on the d file. But then my king can just gobble the pawn on e5, and the only way d7 would be a threat in that case is if my rook is not on the back rank, able to blockade on d8. So the black king and rook are very effectively stopping white's passed pawns here, while black can create a passed pawn on each side of the board. And if you have any experience looking at endgames involving rooks and pawns, you might remember that when a defender's rook is on the file next to an attacker's passed pawn, which is likely to be the case here, black's probably going to create a passed pawn on the f file, for example, by playing g4 and f3. It's kind of a bad position for the defender's rook, because when the attacker's pawn gets to the 7th rank, it's guarding the back rank square that rook would like to move to defend against the pawn queening. So I was starting to feel like maybe black had an advantage here. Mike played king b4, I played a6. White doesn't have much to do, he just has to kind of wait around and see what black's going to do. So there's no reason not to play an improving move like a6, which advances one of my queenside pawns and takes the b5 square away from the white king. Rook e3 from Mike. All right, and now white is thinking about moving along the third rank either to c3 or to h3, attacking the h6 pawn. And I have a little problem for you. I played f4, moving toward creating a passed pawn. And I think white has two major options here, the two I just listed. One is to offer black a king and pawn ending with rook c3. And the other is to look for counterplay with the rook, with rook h3, trying to grab this pawn on h6. And I wonder if you can figure out which of those moves is the right one. One of them holds the position together for white, keeps things equal, and the other one loses. So pause the video if you want to and see if you can figure it out. Alright, you may have calculated that after rook c3, if black takes on c3 and king takes c3, black will not be able to touch these pawns on e5 and d6, because as soon as he grabs the e5 pawn, the d pawn queens. But as long as the king can stay on e6 and d7, those pawns will never advance unless they have the support of the white king. So the question is, can black from this position create his two passed pawns, one on each side of the board, and use those to win? For example, if it were already true that black had a passed pawn on the f-file and a passed pawn on the b-file, it would probably just be winning for black. Black would play f3, white would have to get in the square of that pawn, and then after b5, he could continue to move toward the f-pawn, but then after b4, grabbing the f-pawn leaves him unable to re-enter the square of the pawn, because he can't get his king back to d3. But after rook c3, rook takes c3, king takes c3, g4, looking to create a passed pawn on the king side, king d4, and by the way, this next part I haven't really checked with a computer, I just forgot to, so I may be wrong about this, and I hope you'll let me know if I am. White hopes to just go over here and gobble up these black pawns, and the kind of natural thing for black to do about that is to try to create another passed pawn on the queen side with b5. But this gives up control of the c5 square. And after f3, g takes f3, g takes f3, king c6, both players are going to create queens, f2, d7, f1, and d8, and black has more material is equal, but black can probably win a pawn or two. But anytime you're in this kind of queen ending, it's really hard to figure out whether or not you're able to win when you're the side that has an extra pawn. And if black tries to advance his queenside pawns the other way with a5, hoping to keep control of c5 for long enough for that square to no longer matter, I guess he's just hoping for king e4, b5, and then getting in king takes f4, b4, when white gets back inside the square of the pawn with king e4, a4. Oh, this doesn't quite work out the way I thought it did. I hate when this happens late in a recording because I don't want to restart the whole thing. Okay, but anyway, let's just go with what I was going to say. After a5, white can play a4, and by doing this, he uses one pawn to stop two. And if black sacrifices at some point with b5, then after a takes b5, both players will queen. Ooh, I made a mistake here. We want the white king moving to d3, not d4, because in that... but then b5 doesn't allow king c5. Alright, so I don't remember my analysis of this position very well, but what I do remember, so black may be winning here, but it's at least close, and perhaps it's actually a draw. But the problem is that after rook c3, black doesn't have to trade immediately. He can throw in the move a5 check. And the white king must continue to defend the rook on c3, so king b3 is forced, and now a4 check. And again, white has to continue to defend the rook on c3, so capturing the pawn is not an option. And after either king b2 or king b4, now black can trade on c3, and go ahead and play g4. And this position is definitely winning for black. For example, king to d3, b5, and if white now goes after these pawns on the king side, king e4, f3, gf3, gf3, is that what I wanted to do? Hold it together, man. b4, and if king takes f4, there's b3, when black will create a queen. And if white tries to stop that with the same technique he used in the other variation, holding back 2 pawns with 1, this time those 2 pawns are 1 more rank up the board, and it turns out to make a big difference. At some point, black will sacrifice with b4, and after a takes b4, black has 3 moves to queen, and white has 4, and black's moving first. And what that means is white will not only create a queen first, white will not only be able to move his queen first, but black won't even have a queen when white makes his first queen move, which usually means wrong color names. Wow, this is not going that well right now. b4, a takes b4. Okay, so imagine the white king gets distracted over here on the king side, and we get a3, c5, a2, c6, a1, c7. Black gets the first move with the queen, and white doesn't even have a queen yet. And that usually is winning for the side with the queen. King and pawn endings are hard. So hard that even if you've analyzed them, you forget everything. Okay, so yeah, rook c3 would be a blunder, at least because it allows a5 and a4 with tempo, followed by the trade, and then black has a winning position. So Mike correctly played rook h3 instead. I don't know if he saw a5, a4, or if he just, on principle, decided not to enter a king and pawn ending unless he could calculate it completely. Either way, he made the right choice. I took the pawn on e5, Mike captured on h6, and I played rook d8. Okay, and I sort of expected him to play d7 here. When rook takes d7, rook takes b5 just looks like a draw to me. But instead he went after my g-pawn with rook to g6. And this allows black to keep trying for the win. I played king f5, attacking the rook and defending the g-pawn, and the white rook is obligated to defend the pawn on d6, so he has to go to the h6 square. g4 now threatens to create a passed pawn with f3, and the black king is guarding the square from which the white rook would like to go after that f-pawn. King c4 from Mike. All right, and there are 2 options here for black, I think. One is to create a passed pawn immediately. The other is to do what I did and first throw in the move king g5, forcing, again, a lateral rook move from white, with the idea that now, after the creation of a passed pawn, the black rook will be able to come to the f-file to defend the pawn and help it queen. I played f3, g takes f3, g takes f3, and king d3 from Mike, and he is inside the square of this pawn, so his king is able to get to it. All right, and now after defending after a bad opening and eventually getting counterplay and equalizing the game, I now had a real chance, not a computer chance, but a practical chance to win the game. I had to find a difficult move to find here, and that's king to f5. Basically just going back to where I was a moment ago and hoping to trick white into playing rook h6, continuing to defend the pawn on d6. Because if he does, now the move rook f8 strangely wins the game, despite the fact that I just put my king on that file, stopping the black rook from protecting the pawn on f3. And it wins because of a combination of a threat to play f2, f1, and to move the king out of the way with tempo hitting the rook on h6. So for example, king e3, and now a couple of moves win for black, one of which is f2, when white can't take the pawn or he drops the rook on h6. And he has nowhere to move the white rook from which it does anything to stop the queening of the pawn. He can deliver a spite check, but then after king g6, he can't defend against f1 queen. Never mind protect the rook on h5. Okay, but I missed that and played rook to f8 instead. And this forces rook e1 from white. King e3 would not have been adequate because f2 would have queened the pawn. And now I played rook f6, kind of resigning myself to a draw at this point, but giving white some extra chances to make mistakes. These are not mistakes white, in this case, is likely to make because he's a very strong player. But even mistakes he's not likely to make are worth giving him the chance to make because they have some kind of value, however small. So white could blunder here with king e4, allowing rook e6 check, winning the rook on e1. Mike instead correctly played king to e3. I threw in rook e6 check, again giving him the chance to screw up with king f3. He didn't do that, he played king f2, defending the rook on e1. And now I went ahead and took the pawn on d6. Mike played king takes f3, and I played rook d2, forking the pawns on h2 and a2, hoping to end up a pawn and to be able to try for some kind of a cheap win at the end of the game. All right, Mike played rook to e2, and here's your next question about king and pawn endings. Was this a good move for white? How do you evaluate the move rook takes e2 here from black? Is it winning for black, winning for white, or is it a draw? In fact, I did play rook takes e2, and after king takes e2, king g4. And I'm just kind of hoping that white will passively defend the h-pawn, for example with king f2, king h3, king g1, and then will waste enough moves with his king that I somehow get in g5, g4, h5, h4, and g3, and I get a pawn into queen. It's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen against a player in the expert category. I mean, it's never going to happen against anyone with a 4-digit rating, let's say. But you gotta give your opponent chances to make mistakes, or he can't make them. But what you have to evaluate here is what happens if white goes after the black pawns with king to e3. Was this a really bad mistake from black to trade rooks, or is this still a draw? It turns out, after king e3, as Mike played in the game, there's king h3, king d4, king takes h2, king d5, and this looks pretty scary for black because white is now going to gobble up both of these pawns. After king g3, king c6, already black has to be very accurate. If king f4, king takes b6, king e5, king takes a6, king d6, white boxes out the black king with king to b6, covering the c5, c6, and c7 squares. And if black tries to sneak around to c8, white simply follows him, again covering the 3 squares black wants to use to get at the white pawn. And now white's a4, a5, all the way to a8 is unstoppable. So after king to c6, black has to play b5. Mike played king b6, I played king to f4, and after king takes a6, again here you have to be accurate. If king to e5, king takes b5, king d6, again white wins with king b6. So after king takes a6, the drawing move is king b4. And the game was agreed drawn here, but if it had continued, it would have finished king b5, king e5, king takes b4, king d6, when white can't stop black from reaching these critical squares which allow him to draw the game when he's facing a rook pawn. For example, king b5, king c7, king a6, king b8. King b8 is not necessary here. Black can be on c8, c7. It's all a draw. But king b6, king a8, a4, king b8, a5, king a8, a6, king b8, a7 check, king a8. And you probably recognize this position. It's one in which white either has to abandon the defense of his pawn or deliver stalemate. Okay, so once again I managed to stick my queen on a5 inappropriately in a Grunfeld and get a really bad position. I'll have to work even harder to not do that in the future. But I did recover in the middle game and managed to hold on. And so that was the 3rd round of the Worcester tournament. And I'm at 2 out of 3 so far, and I think I have the white pieces next week against FIDE Master John Curto, so that should be a good game. I generally get killed by him when I have black, but I do pretty well with white, scoring mostly draws and 1 or 2 wins. And I missed the first round of the Fitchburg tournament because of work, so I got a half-point bye there, and I'm at 0.5 out of 1. All right, I'll see you next week.